folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. As a forewarning, this episode will be less linear than previous ones. We will begin picking up right where we left off after the Battle of New Orleans in 1816, which will lead into a discussion on some of the most important changes that came to the city in the boom years of the 1820s and 30s. Then we will discuss the political trajectory of Louisiana, New Orleans, and America during these same years, and how the stories of the leading politicians on these stages tie into the changes we previously discussed. In order to avoid confusing you any more than I probably already have, we will dive right into it. We last left off with the Battle of New Orleans. It was etched into the history of our city as one of its most dramatic events. There was certainly a lot of dramatic hullabaloo going on immediately after the battle, with balls, parties, parades, and solemn military ceremonies to celebrate the brave soldiers who defended the city and honor those who died for it. Those whose stories are wrapped up in the dramatization of the Battle of New Orleans and whom history has given a heroic light to, despite their shortcomings, each of them had their own reward for the ordeal. Governor Claiborne finished out his term as first governor of Louisiana at the end of 1816. He was widely recognized across the state as the cool-headed and effective administrator who had deftly guided the state through its tumultuous period of infancy. This popularity allowed him to win the senatorial election in 1817, although he would only serve for 9 months of this term before he succumbed to liver disease in November of 1817. Although he was only 42 when he died, Claiborne lived quite a full life, and his leadership stint in New Orleans is a major reason why the city was able to navigate its way through the transition from French colony to American state. His legacy lives on in New Orleans and Louisiana, as many prominent fixtures bear his name, such as Claiborne Avenue, Claiborne Parish, and the Claiborne Building in Baton Rouge. It goes without saying that Claiborne wasn't the only politician to use the Battle of New Orleans to climb the political ladder. The battle offered a step up for Major General Andrew Jackson, a step that would eventually lead him all the way to the presidency 13 years later. As for the Lafitte's and their Baratarian privateers, Jackson held true to his word and awarded them with full pardons for all crimes committed against the United States after the battle. He did not, however, return the ships and 500,000 goods seized from the raid on Barataria Island. Essentially broke, it would not take long for the Lafitte's to get back into their old ways. There was a question about how they would get started again, as their base of operations on Barataria Island had been destroyed, and the U.S. Army had shown that they could easily dispose of any troublesome criminals who took up residence there. The Lafitte's refound their footing by volunteering their services to the Spanish crown as spies. The Spanish were embroiled in the 11-year conflict known as the Mexican War of Independence. At this time, in 1815, the Mexican revolutionaries were fighting a protracted guerrilla war throughout New Spain. The territory involved was expansive, stretching from California to Texas, and encompassing all of modern-day Mexico. Finding isolated pockets of rebels in this large expanse of territory was difficult, and so the Spanish crown was eager to accept the help of the Lafitte's. Once again, the brothers split up, with Pierre remaining in New Orleans to report on any merchants he suspected of shipping supplies to the rebels. Meanwhile, Jean made his way to Galveston Island, just off the coast of Spanish Texas. It was suspected that Galveston Island was a gathering point for revolutionaries, and Jean's mission was to inform upon the comings and goings of suspicious characters on the island. He arrived on the island in 1817, and immediately felt quite comfortable, as Galveston heavily resembled his old stomping grounds at Barataria. Ironically, 14 days after Lafitte set foot on Galveston Island, all the Mexican revolutionaries left it. Still, Jean reported back to the Spanish that he would set up a base on the island and report on anything he saw. This was a nice little excuse to start up another privateering business. This time, his base of operations would be a lot further from the bustling metropolis of New Orleans and outside the jurisdiction of the American authorities. But Jean had no intention of just selling information on rebel activity to the Spanish. In no time at all, he had restarted his privateering ways, this time under the guise of the flag of Mexico. Lafitte's ships flew the Mexican flag as a form of plausible deniability. If the Spanish authorities, or anyone else for that matter, managed to capture one of the privateers, they would just say that they were raiding the merchant ships on behalf of the rebellion, and Lafitte's hands would remain clean. They did not, however, actively participate in the rebellion, beyond maybe selling some goods to the rebels for a decent price. Within a year, Lafitte's business was flourishing, and he was raking in around $2 million annually. In contrast to his romanticized persona, which was created before, during, and perpetuated after the Battle of New Orleans, Jean Lafitte was no hero. The bulk of the $2 million of profit came from one branch of his business, slavery. In 1818, the United States had officially banned the import of foreign slaves. It had been de facto abolished for quite some time, but the solidification of the law meant that now enterprising privateers such as Lafitte could charge a premium on human souls due to the danger now inherent in smuggling them into the country. During the 3 years that Jean operated from Galveston Island, a large number of the slaves illegally brought into New Orleans and then distributed across the South came from the Lafittes. The enslaved people that the Lafittes ruthlessly captured were not taken from Africa by them personally. Most often they were aboard Spanish slave ships bound for Cuba, when the privateers commandeered them and changed their destination to New Orleans. This practice continued up until 1821, when one of the ships in Lafitte's fleet made the mistake of firing on a merchant ship that was flying in an American flag. A response from the federal government was forthcoming, and the USS Enterprise, no relation to Star Trek, was dispatched to the Gulf of Mexico to put a stop to Lafitte's antics. Jean left Galveston without a fight and continued to operate in the Caribbean, no longer pretending to be a privateer and assuming the full mantle of pirate. His career and life would end in 1823, with a commission in the Navy of the recently independent country of Gran Colombia, which consisted of current-day Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. After he engaged in fighting in February of 1823 with 2 Spanish warships, Jean Lafitte was injured and presumed to die of his wounds soon after. It wouldn't be appropriate for such a legendary figure as Jean Lafitte to simply just bow out of the historical narrative in such an anticlimactic fashion, so of course stories spread throughout the years of the supposed real fate of the swashbuckling gentleman from New Orleans. There were rumors that he escaped the battle with the Spanish warships and made his way to North Carolina to settle down until he died peacefully there in 1875. There were other stories that posited that Lafitte faked his death and made his way to St. Helena Island, where the deposed Emperor Napoleon was in exile. According to this tale, Lafitte and Napoleon made their escape to Louisiana and lived out the rest of their lives there in secret. Truly, there is no limit but one's imagination when it comes to heroic figures of history. Lafitte's actions around the Battle of New Orleans had made him a folk hero, but we must be careful when venerating such figures. Was Jean Lafitte an important man in the history of New Orleans? Of course he was. Was he a hero with personal character that should be celebrated? Absolutely not. Jean Lafitte was first and foremost a criminal. He made his living off exploiting innocent merchants, and worse, he was a prolific participant in the slave trade. The naming of the National Historical Park System in and around New Orleans after such a man is obviously a point of controversy. Some would make an argument that Lafitte's importance in the story of New Orleans affords him some leniency with regards to his immorality, but others would take the stance that we should recognize the significance of his contribution to the Battle of New Orleans without giving respect to an enslaver of humanity, and just rename the parks after a New Orleanian who contributed something more positive to the city. That is the debate that exists around Lafitte in the modern day. But we must now return to New Orleans in 1816, with the aftermath of the War of 1812. The years after 1816 were shaping up to be ones of tremendous growth for New Orleans. It had stumbled at the starting blocks upon its emergence into statehood due to the war, but it would soon make up for lost time. Its unique location, culture, and climate would contribute to the factors drawing a mass migration of Americans to the city, where, upon arriving, they found the peculiarities of the native population in most cases surprising and in some cases unsettling. The austere American immigrants were put off by the Creole traditions surrounding Sunday, the day of worship. The French Revolution had been the greatest movement of anti-religious ideas in history during the radical days of the 1790s, but the rule of Emperor Napoleon reversed most of the most extreme dismissal of the Church. By 1816, Catholicism was back in style across the globe, but the Protestant Americans couldn't help but feel like the French Creoles of New Orleans were holding on to some of those radical liberal ideas of religion. In New Orleans, a large portion of the population went to High Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, or any other Catholic church in town, but notably the shops did not close on Sunday as they did in almost every other American town. The churchgoers would sing their hymns, pray their prayers, and then spend the rest of Sunday as they would any other day of the week. Did this more liberal interpretation of the holy day of rest come from the unholy French Revolution? Actually, no, it had always been this way in New Orleans, but for the first time it was seen as out of the ordinary by the mass of Americans arriving in the city. The way the Creoles practiced religion was only one of many unique aspects of their culture, and drew more of a curiosity than a criticism from outsiders. The part of New Orleans culture that truly unsettled the newcomers was their attitude towards the different races. In particular, there was a strange dichotomy at work among Creole women and their slaves. The white women, of which a majority were originally from Saint-Domingue, had a habit of alternating between a familiarity with their enslaved handmaidens that bordered upon the tender love shown to a family member, and then brutally, cruelly beating them with cowhides that they carried with them wherever they went. It was a truly sadistic the way in which these women would act so close to the enslaved people, even going as far as to openly discuss personal matters with them, and then turn on a dime to torture them for no discernible reason. The seemingly psychotic nature of this relationship that was common enough for multiple American sources to comment on it in their writings can only really be understood as a reaction to the unique tradition of the races within New Orleans. Throughout the rest of the South, there were clearly defined roles for each race. Most of, if not all, the whites occupied a position of power and wealth that was never ever attained by a person of color, while the vast majority of people of color were assigned to the role of slave with no hope of an upward mobility or freedom. In New Orleans, there was a significant portion of the population that was relatively well-off people of color, especially women of color, and the practices of the Spanish era meant that even the enslaved held more dignity than their counterparts elsewhere in the South. This might have created an underlying anxiety among the Creole population that their rung on the societal ladder might be taken from them. This anxiety would have been especially manifest in Creole women, as they saw their husbands regularly cheat on them with women of color, and saw these consorts attain a level of economic freedom that even most white women couldn't dream of. This mixture of more liberal traditions with respect to slavery and people of color and the anxiety of losing your place within the social hierarchy materialized as the practice of caressing and cowhiding. One of the greatest sources on the point of view of newcomers arriving in New Orleans after 1816 comes from the British architect Benjamin Latrobe, whose most notable contribution to the world is the design of the American Capitol building, which is now home to the House of Representatives and the Senate. He was commissioned to design the Capitol after his countrymen burned the last one down in the War of 1812, but he didn't stick around Washington, D.C. to see the building completed. He had tasked his son with completing a waterworks project in New Orleans, but in 1817 the younger Latrobe died of yellow fever, and Benjamin moved to New Orleans to complete the project and take care of his son's widow and grandchildren, who were, to his great surprise, mixed race. Grandpa Latrobe kept detailed journals and illustrations of everything he witnessed in New Orleans, most of which astounded his rigid and traditional views. Despite his prejudices, Latrobe is an important source for details on the musical tradition of black New Orleanians around this time. He did not specifically seek out and document the black musicians in ballrooms or at Congo Square, but by this time they were so ubiquitous to New Orleans that it was impossible to avoid them, and Latrobe documented everything he saw. He was the first to record a sighting of a stringed instrument that people of color played in Congo Square, which was a precursor to the modern banjo. This instrument had undoubtedly been played by black musicians in New Orleans for generations, as its design harkens back to the Senegambians that were the original enslaved people brought to the colony back in the early 1700s. Latrobe also wrote in tremendous detail about the different types of drums used by black musicians, and we can use his descriptions to connect these instruments with ones used by other enslaved peoples across the world, and then connect all of these back to their origins in the Congo. Just from the illustration of a drum, we can slowly piece together the stolen history of black Americans. But Congo Square wasn't just unique because it was a blend of Senegambian and Congolese musical instruments to create a special New Orleans sound. It was unique because nowhere else in the American South were people of color allowed to practice such traditional gatherings. It would have been great if Latrobe had spent more time in New Orleans, as he would have undoubtedly contributed greatly to the historiography of the area, but in 1820 he also died of yellow fever, exactly 3 years after his son. It is ironic that the waterworks that both Latrobes built were huge breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that carried the yellow fever that killed them and many, many other New Orleanians for the next 80 or so years. Yellow fever epidemics would remain a leading cause of death in the Crescent City well into the 20th century. With so much death in the city, it is no wonder that spirits, hauntings, voodoo, and funerals became such an integral part of New Orleans culture. Speaking of that hallmark of modern New Orleans identity, voodoo, it is during this period of the city's history that the practice of voodoo became noticeably more popular, even outside its origins among the enslaved peoples. We already went over some of the origins of voodoo in the first episode of this series, and it has been mentioned a couple times since. Whether it is the real cultural practice of the art, or the cheap, rather insulting imitation of it for tourism, is markedly different from the voodoo of the first enslaved Africans who arrived in New Orleans. The biggest changes came from the Saint Domingan refugees and the few slaves they managed to bring with them. In Haiti, voodoo was practiced differently and much more seriously than it was in Louisiana. For one, Haitian voodoo placed particular importance in animal sacrifice and elaborate rituals to commune with the dead. These practices were reported by many white Saint Domingans as evidence of the satanic and perverse nature of the rebelling slaves, and indeed some of the reasons why the slaves did these rituals was to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. In Louisiana, there wasn't as much of a reason to partake in animal sacrifice, or to inspire dread in their oppressors. There had never been a comparable scale and brutality of violence that there had been in Saint-Domingue, so their voodoo was more of a means to connect with their lost ancestors and the religious traditions of the disparate parts of Africa they hailed from. As an example, the iconic voodoo dolls and talismans called grigri likely originated from the Senegambian Africans, since they came from a more Islamized region where the practice of wearing talismans inscribed with prayers was common. The easiest way to discuss how voodoo was evolving and becoming more popularized during the period immediately following the Battle of New Orleans is to follow the life of Marie Catherine Laveau, later to hold the title of Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. Marie Laveau was the quintessential New Orleanian, as she embodied many of the unique mixtures and contradictions of the city that made it stand out. She was born during the maelstrom of political change that came at the start of the 19th century. On September 10, 1801, Marie came into the world as a subject of the Spanish crown, although the city and territory she was born in had already been promised to be returned to France. Before her 3rd birthday, she would become a French subject, and finally an American citizen. She was lucky to be young enough to not really have to worry about how much Louisiana changing hands would affect her identity, but she wasn't just a mixture of nationalities. Marie Laveau had claim to ancestry from all the different groups that lived in and around New Orleans. Her mother was a free woman of color who was of African, European, and Native American descent. As a consequence of Marie being born out of wedlock, there is a degree of uncertainty to who her father was, but as her mother was a relatively well-off citizen of New Orleans, we can assume that her father was of somewhat high social standing. Unfortunately, this meant that Marie Laveau would participate in the most shameful aspect of New Orleans high society. Even though Marie was a woman of color and had African ancestry, she, as a prominent woman in society, was expected to own at least one slave to do the manual labor of taking care of her home. She would end up owning several over her lifetime. When Marie was 18 years old, she stepped foot into the last major demographic in New Orleans that she did not yet have ties to, when she married a free man of color who happened to be a San Domingan refugee. They were married in St. Louis Cathedral in 1819, which notably allowed people of all races to attend Mass, unlike the segregated Protestant churches. Marie was a devout Catholic for her entire life and saw no conflict between her faith in God and her practice of voodoo. People of color had been mixing traditional Native and African beliefs with European Christianity for centuries, and voodoo was no exception to this. Marie and her husband Jacques Paris would only be married for 4 years before Jacques passed away. I would like to note that it is a testament to the power and influence that Marie had as a woman of color that she is remembered by her maiden name, Laveau, rather than Marie Paris, or the name of her unofficial life partner, the French nobleman Glapion. While on official documents, Marie was forced by law to be recognized by her male partners' names. In the professional world, she would always be Queen Marie Laveau. Speaking of the professional world, Marie was a prominent businesswoman in New Orleans her entire life. Her official occupation was hairdresser, and she owned her own beauty parlor where she worked. But hairdressing was more of a front for what Marie was more known for. She peddled in herbal medicine, poisons, divination, rituals, gree-gree, and most importantly, secrets. Her connections via the beauty parlor to the members of elite society in New Orleans allowed her to collect a treasure trove of secrets, which she used to puppeteer the city in ways that made people truly believe she practiced magic. How else could a lowly hairdresser affect the behavior of a mighty judge of the courts, if not through the use of a voodoo ritual, or know the deepest, darkest secret of every woman she met? However, during the point in time that we are currently in, Marie Laveau was just beginning her practice. She was still being tutored in the ways of voodoo by New Orleans' first queen, Cenit Didi. Most of Marie's most famous exploits will have to be discussed later, as there are other important things happening in New Orleans that we must cover before moving on. The post-war period in New Orleans from 1820 to 1830 was one of economic boom. The sugar plantations that had begun popping up in Louisiana before the war were now flourishing and spreading across the state, necessitating a massive importation of slaves from the other southern states. This was the purpose of New Orleans for this decade, and even further leading up to the Civil War. It was the major hub for sugar export and the slave trade. By the 1840s, Louisiana was producing up to 50% of the sugar consumed by Americans, and New Orleans was the primary benefactor in this trade monopoly. It was protected from the dominance of Cuba in the sugar market by economic protectionism that reigned supreme in American politics. All of this prosperity led to New Orleans becoming the third largest city in America by 1840, and by far the richest and largest city in the South. This prominence was not just due to sugar and slavery. Well, it was, but in a more tangential way. New Orleans was so important because of its location. Before railroads crisscrossed the nation, the Mississippi was the most important mode of freight transportation on the continent. It wouldn't be until 1830 that the first intercity railroad would be constructed, and although the transportation industry would spread at a ludicrous pace, New Orleans still had some time to operate as the essential trade hub on the Mississippi. During the 1820s, the population boom was driven mostly by immigration, rather than an increase in local births. It was a testament to just how torrential the wave of migration was that during this period, yellow fever continued to eat away at the population every summer. These immigrants included many prominent French citizens who were fleeing their motherland after the collapse of Napoleon's French Empire in 1815. When the empire ceased to exist, France did not return to being a republic. Instead, the Bourbon dynasty was re-established as the sovereign rulers of France, and it was famously remarked that they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. This meant that the Bourbon king Louis XVIII was out for revenge against those that he believed had wronged his family. Any French Republican or Bonapartist quickly got the hell out of Dodge, and many ended up in New Orleans. The influx of well-educated and well-to-do French speakers meant that as far as languages, French remained the majority spoken in New Orleans up until 1830. The French were also joined at this time by a notable number of German and Irish immigrants. Unlike the wealthy French speakers, these immigrants were mostly manual laborers and farmers, meaning it was most likely that your lawyer spoke French, while the man that cleaned your street spoke German. All of these European immigrants, American migrants, and the slave trade meant that the population of New Orleans had almost doubled from 1810 to 1820, and again almost doubled from 1820 to 1830. The next population boom would more than double the occupation of the city from 1830 to 1840. In the first 30 years of New Orleans being a part of the United States, the population went from around 17,000 to over 100,000. Money and people were flowing into the city from all sides, bringing with them progress and problems. Progress could be marked by the expansion of the city and the founding of new industries. The early 19th century was a time of great change, not just in New Orleans, but for the rest of America, as the Industrial Revolution really began to take off. When so much change comes so rapidly, it can be hard for policymakers to keep their heads above water. Such was the case in the early 1830s, as a potential economic crisis loomed over America. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, had been elected in 1832 under the banner of democratic populism. He was billed as a champion of the common people, and he took this role seriously, attempting to wrest control of the federal government out of the hands of the industrial capitalists and give it to the yeoman frontiersman and small landholder. His economic policies reflected this goal, as President Jackson refused to charter a new national centralized bank, as he viewed this institution as primarily an appendage of the merchant and financial classes of the northern states, to be used to leverage power to those states at the cost of the rural populace. The lack of a central bank to steady the financial market, compounded with a shortage of physical cash, to slow down economic growth in the United States. The technology and enthusiasm for growth was there, but the money to fuel the engine of progress was simply absent. At this time, the lack of American hard specie meant that foreign currencies were still widely accepted, especially the Spanish dollar, which, if you recall, was the basis of American currency thanks to New Orleans. The use of foreign currency weakened the U.S. in the global market and lowered its prestige in the eyes of the powerful European countries. Hoping to rectify this situation, Jackson's government established 3 new mints in the South to stimulate growth and move the center of financial power out of the currently dominant North. One of these mints was built in New Orleans. The U.S. Mint in New Orleans was by far the most important of the 3, and possibly the most important mint in the country, as New Orleans conducted more foreign trade than any other city at this time. The New Orleans Mint was also the only way to produce silver coins, along with the more common gold ones. Now the mint had been commissioned in 1835, but was not yet operational when the Panic of 1837 hit the U.S. The Panic was a culmination of all the economic problems that had been building up during the 1830s, and resulted in a severe depression that lasted really until the California Gold Rush in 1848. Luckily for New Orleans, its new mint and its ties to foreign capital through trade allowed it to weather the storm and continue growing even while the rest of the country staggered from the blow of the Panic. All of this growth necessitated an expansion of transportation, for both people and goods. In 1836, the city had grown so much that it had to be divided into 3 municipalities to facilitate easier governance. The first municipality was the Old Town, that being the original French quarter that had been plotted in 1721, along with the Treme district that housed most of the Dominican Creole population. The 2 boundaries would be Canal Street and Esplanade Avenue. Everything upriver of Canal Street became uptown, and everything downriver of Esplanade Avenue became downtown, with the quarter being sandwiched in the middle. In order to traverse this now sprawling city, the New Orleans city government built one of the first railroads in the U.S., the Pontchartrain Railroad, to carry passengers and cargo between Lake Pontchartrain to the Mississippi riverfront. It was a modest line by modern standards, being a little thinner and only 6 miles long. The train was first drawn by a team of horses, but they were soon replaced by a steam locomotive imported from Great Britain. The modest little train was good enough for carrying people and freight from the lake to the river, but it only serviced 2 stops, and the growing city needed a way to transport goods throughout the metropolitan area, especially uptown, which was quickly becoming the commercial center of New Orleans. To this end, in 1838, the New Basin Canal was expanded to stretch the waterway all the way up past Canal Street. One thing to note as all this change was happening in New Orleans is that with the introduction of new technology and new routes of transportation, life began speeding up at a rate that was inconceivable just a few decades ago. For most of human history, progress had come gradually and slowly, but as the Industrial Revolution took hold around the globe, much like the trains it introduced, society began moving faster than anyone could control. It used to be that change could be measured between generations, but now people were witnessing centuries-old traditions disappearing and being replaced within their lifetimes. The old Congo Square that had been the center of music and community for the enslaved and free people of color since the very first days of New Orleans was shut down. New city ordinances decreed that the weekly gatherings at the square would cease immediately, and the space would be renamed Place d'Armes, and would from now on be used for military drills. The renaming of Congo Square to Place d'Armes coincided with the renaming of the central plaza of the French Quarter into Jackson Square. Jackson Square had previously worn the title Place d'Armes, and you can imagine how confusing this must have been for old residents of the city, who not only had to remember the new name of the central square, but could easily confuse it with the now converted Congo Square. "I thought you told me to meet you at Place d'Armes." "Yeah, I did." "Well, I went there and there was nothing but a bunch of men in military uniform marching in step." "Oh, I totally forgot. I meant the old Place d'Armes. That's called Jackson Square, you old goat." Even before Congo Square was repurposed, those who had visited it from when they were children in the mid-1700s to now in the early 1800s could tell that just as the hands and feet of the drummers and dancers never stopped moving, the music never stopped evolving. Each new group of people of color that arrived in New Orleans was like a stone being tossed into the cultural stream. They created ripples and waves that distorted the surface temporarily, and once it had settled, the stream's course was always altered slightly. The first Africans to take root at the square were contrary to its later name, not Congolese but mostly Senegambian. Their music was heavily influenced by Islamic chants, swaying rhythms, and stringed instruments that were common in northwestern Africa. Then when the Spanish restarted the stalled slave trade when they took over the colony, the majority of the people they expropriated from their homes were from the Congo. Their music was based on drumming and rhythms that could be clapped and stomped to, rather than the swaying motion of the Islamized Senegambians. These two styles could have conflicted with each other, but instead they blended together and were fused under the heat and pressure of their difficult existence as slaves to create a wholly unique Afro-Louisiana soul. Over the course of a century, new peoples would blend and fuse with this soul: the Afro-Cubans, the Dominicans, the African-American Protestants, and of course the people who were there since before the beginning, the Native Americans. All these people came together at the beating heart of Congo Square, and it was an incalculable loss when it was shut down. But the music and culture was not snuffed out. Instead, it was dispersed throughout the city, less visible than it had been when hundreds of people had filled the air with music and shook the ground with dance at Congo Square, but no less resilient and important. At least they were important culturally. Less so within the realm of politics, as all people of color lacked political power, mainly due to them being excluded from the franchise. So politics trundled on after 1815 without consideration of the massive black population of Louisiana. Instead, it was mainly concerned with the struggle for power between the entrenched Creole elite and the aggressive, insistent Anglo-Americans. Governor Claiborne's government that had reigned in New Orleans since its inception as a part of America had managed to straddle these two camps, mostly by courting the support of the large Dominican demographic to keep the Creoles in line. After 1815, when Claiborne stepped down as governor and would soon unexpectedly die, power passed from him to a Creole man named Jacques Villers. It was a recurring theme in the Spanish period of New Orleans that each subsequent governor had some sort of connection to the pragmatic Inspector General Alejandro O'Reilly. Valère continued this tradition, although his connection to O'Reilly was less friendly than his predecessors. Valère's father had been one of the men tied up in the Creole revolt that O'Reilly put down, and while most of those involved in the revolt escaped relatively unscathed, he was not so lucky. He was sentenced to death and mysteriously died before the sentence could be carried out. But Valère's connection to Louisiana goes back even further than any governor before or since him, as his grandfather was a part of the original expedition led by Iberville to explore the Gulf Coast. All this is to say that Valère was the epitome of the native Creole elite that had held power in New Orleans since the very beginning. His opponent in the election of 1816 was quite the opposite. Joshua Lewis was a Virginia native who had only moved to New Orleans 11 years earlier to serve as a judge on the newly established Supreme Court of the Territory of Orleans. He clearly represented the fresh crop of Anglo-Americans seeking to draw New Orleans further into the embrace of the United States. The loss of Lewis and the triumph of Valère was by no means a resounding rejection of American political influence, as Valère squeaked by in the popular vote with only 52%. It is important to note that elections at this time were quite a bit less democratic than what they are today. Less than 5,000 people voted in the polls, mostly due to the strict voting laws that only allowed upper and middle-class landowners to vote. It was even more restricted by the fact that this limited popular vote was only to select the two candidates for governor. Ultimately, it was the 46-member General Assembly who chose who became governor. Here, Valère had a much more significant victory, as he earned the vote of 43 of the 46 electors. Once again, I have to reiterate that politics at this time was largely tied to ethnicity rather than party. Both Valère and Lewis ran under the banner of the Democratic Republicans, who were the ascendant party during the era of good feelings, not just in New Orleans or Louisiana, but throughout the country. Due to the peculiar rule laid out in the Louisiana state constitution that governors could not serve consecutive terms, the ethnicity of the head of state government flip-flopped between Anglo-Americans and Creoles, even into the reintroduction of party politics. Along with the technological, cultural, and economic changes that were exploding in New Orleans throughout the 1820s and 30s, there were these parallel political changes, which can often be a useful lens in which to observe such times. The intersection and intertwining of business, culture, and politics helps us to visualize the framework of history, and so we will go through the political history of New Orleans during these early decades of the 1800s and show how they influence and are influenced by the material circumstances of the city. As I already mentioned, the governorship of Louisiana passed from the Anglo-American Claiborne to the Creole Louisianian Valère in 1816, in a race that was only between two candidates from the Democratic Republicans. In the presidential election of that same year, James Monroe, a DR, blew out the last Federalist presidential candidate, Rufus King, with almost 73% of the vote. Although the Federalist Party wouldn't officially disband until 1828, the 1816 election was really its last gasp of breath. Although the dominance of the DRs within Louisiana and the rest of the country is largely attributed to their rivals discrediting themselves after the War of 1812, it was also because the DRs blunted any nascent opposition by practicing pragmatic policy concessions. There would be no opposition to the DRs on economic grounds because they adopted some of their opposition's wedge issues as a part of their platform, most notably the creation of a central bank. As we have discussed, this issue will be one of the cracks that eventually tears the Democratic Republicans apart, but for now it was recognized as a necessary concession to make to avoid the formation of a strong opposition party. In New Orleans, Valère was on board with this new direction of the party. Valère is less remembered and less interesting than his predecessor, as the era of good feelings doesn't really have the dramatic historical set pieces of the previous years with the War of 1812 and Louisiana's statehood, but he fulfilled his duty as the representative of the wealthy Creoles by instituting bankruptcy protections and lowering state debt, both economic policies that followed the centralization path of the new consensus DRs. Monroe also enacted a foreign policy agenda that suited the desires of New Orleans' economic and political elite. He sought to strengthen trade relations with Great Britain after the War of 1812, which allowed New Orleans' market to thrive during the years of his presidency. But his most famous, or depending on your point of view, infamous acts were in regards to America's future in the Western Hemisphere. In the broad view, the Monroe Doctrine was the idea that America was the predominant power in the hemisphere and should remain so in perpetuity. It flat out refused to accept European meddling in North and South America and set the U.S. on a path of gradually wiping out European colonial holdings in the New World. It began with the seizure of Florida from Spain and would continue with U.S. recognition of independence for all the nations of South America that shook off the Spanish yoke in the coming years. The combination of increased trade with Great Britain and the exclusion of Europeans from the New World meant that New Orleans' importance as a center of trade increased substantially, and as American power grew, so did New Orleans' standing. The other infamous act by Monroe was the Missouri Compromise. The compromise arose out of the defining political issue of the first century of American politics, slavery. Even though there was de facto one-party rule in America during Monroe's presidency, that did not mean that everything was all sunshine and daisies. There was still an ongoing and systemic conflict between the northern and southern states on the issue of slavery, and specifically its expansion or reduction. Complete abolishment was not yet in the spotlight, but the northern states wanted to limit the spread of slavery to new states by instituting legislation that would prohibit any territory from joining the Union unless their constitution specifically forbade the buying and selling of slaves within their borders. For the southern states, this was unacceptable. Their way of life depended not only on the continuation of slavery, but also the creation of new slave markets to further expand their economies so that they could somewhat keep up with the staggering development that the North was going through. As a member of the Virginia dynasty, Monroe was personally on the side of the slave states, but he knew that the era of good feelings would only continue if a pragmatic solution was found to the problem, a solution that would appease both sides and avoid a potentially fatal split in American politics. From the view of Belair, whose family owned a prosperous plantation just east of New Orleans, the southern position was personal. This was an issue that bound the elites of both the Anglo-American and Creole spheres together. They both needed slavery to expand, and the economy of New Orleans in particular relied heavily on this expansion. This was of course in direct opposition to the point of view of the mass of enslaved peoples living in Louisiana, who not only wanted to see the restrictions of slavery, but its ultimate end. But their voices were never heard, and it lay with the moderate reformers in the North to fight the fight. Monroe capitulated to these reformers in March of 1820, when he signed the Missouri Compromise. This act drew a line across the continent from the southern border of the newly admitted state of Missouri. All newly admitted states with any amount of territory north of this line would be free states, and any below it would be slave states. This excluded Missouri and any states that were founded before March of 1820. The compromise achieved only one thing, and that was delaying the resolution of the slavery issue to a later date. The fight between North and South would continue to be the defining political issue of the century. As we can see, although Monroe's first term ushered in the so-called era of good feelings, there was still noticeable problems brewing in the United States, and New Orleans, as one of the most prominent cities in the Union, would feel the effect of any major disturbance most acutely. The presidential elections of 1820 are curious for this reason. Monroe had not been without controversy during his first term. There had been a recession in 1819 as a result of his treading the middle path between economic centralization and decentralization, creating a general distrust in America for banks and federal financial institutions. The Missouri Compromise had made no one happy, but managed to keep the country from tearing itself apart, but Monroe didn't really get credit for this. Despite all this, the Federalists were unable to choose a candidate to run against Monroe in the presidential race, making him the only president other than Washington to run unopposed. However, even though there was no one else officially on the ballot for the electors to select, Monroe did not receive unanimous support from the Electoral College, as Washington had. One elector from New Hampshire proved unfaithful and cast his vote for Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Whether he did this to spite Monroe or to keep Washington's legacy as the only unanimous victor alive is unknown. Unlike this federal election, there was a lot more competition in the 1820 gubernatorial elections of Louisiana. There were 4 candidates who received a significant portion of the popular vote, all of whom represented the Democratic Republicans, but they were split on ethnicity, with 2 being Creole and 2 being Anglo-American. The Anglo-American Thomas B. Robertson ultimately won the election with 45% of the popular vote and winning all but 2 of the General Assembly votes. This marked a significant shift in New Orleans politics, as the Creoles lost control of the state government. Previously, when an Anglo-American had held the governor's office, he had been forced to appease the Creoles on most political issues because of their overwhelming demographic majority in New Orleans and the rest of the state. But now their power was lessened by the influx of American, Irish, and German immigrants, so the Anglo-Americans could start pushing back against Creole influence. The most significant attempt to permanently wrest control of the state and its most important city was to move the capital from New Orleans to a more American-centric city. This action resulted in violent riots throughout New Orleans in 1822, which eventually led to Governor Robertson resigning and the state capital remaining in New Orleans for the time being. Meanwhile in D.C., Monroe was continuing the mission of his first term, not really trying to shake the boat with any drastic changes to policy. The continuity between 1816 and the end of his tenure in office in 1824 is pretty consistent. He continued to attempt to alleviate the problems of the 1819 recession by enacting federal works programs to improve the country's internal infrastructure and transportation networks. One of his more major projects on this front was a $75,000 initiative to make the Ohio and Mississippi rivers more navigable. Since this was still almost a decade before the railroads would begin spreading across America, the Mississippi was still the most important way of moving people and goods between the North and the South. New Orleans was still the most important spot on the Mississippi, so any initiative to increase the efficiency of the riverway naturally benefited the city. As 1824 approached, James Monroe prepared to step down and pass leadership of the country to someone else. The precedent set by George Washington had been 2 terms for a president, no more, even though it wasn't technically illegal to run for a 3rd term. All that was left was really the formality of choosing who, among the Democratic Republicans, would succeed Monroe, since there was still not a viable opposition party. At this point in American history, it was usually assumed that the outgoing president's Secretary of State was the most qualified and appropriate successor, not the vice president as it is today. In any case, Monroe's vice president was an alcoholic in poor physical shape who had been dogged during his term by a court case regarding his private funding of the war in 1812. Scandal-ridden and obviously not long for this world, he would die less than a year after the election of 1824. It seemed certain that the precedent would not be broken, and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams would run unopposed to become the next president of the United States. Except, of course, things would not be that easy, because even though the Democratic Republicans were unopposed from without, they were not without their internal problems. When the Federalist Party dissolved into thin air, its members did not just all fade away into the background. Many of them, including John Quincy Adams, were still prominent politicians, and they sought to find a niche within the now singular political party to continue pushing their agenda in the federal government. James Monroe had tried to be conciliatory to these members of the Democratic-Republican coalition, but there were members of this party that were still staunchly against any Federalist policy. By the election of 1824, factions had arisen within the party, and while none of them felt strong enough to formally split from the coalition, they had become bitter rivals. The 2 main factions contesting the 1824 presidential race were the Adams-Clay Republicans, or National Republicans, and the Jacksonians. As their names suggest, the Adams-Clay Republicans coalesced behind John Quincy Adams and Speaker of the House Henry Clay, while the Jacksonians naturally coalesced behind populist demagogue and frontier war hero Andrew Jackson. These 2 factions trickled down from the national stage to the individual states. Most gubernatorial races were still between Democratic Republicans, but now each candidate felt obligated to take a side in the Adams-Jackson split. In Louisiana, where the candidates had run almost entirely around ethnic lines, the reintroduction of party politics began blurring the lines of support. The eventual winner of the governorship was an Anglo-American named Henry Johnson, who won in part because the Creole vote split between previous Governor Villers and Bernard Marini, who represented opposing sides of the Adams-Jackson split. Henry Johnson supported the National Republicans and was able to entice some of the merchant Creole class over to the Anglo side, since they depended on the heavy tariffs the Adams-Clay faction supported. So we saw the rise of factions create a split ticket in Louisiana, but this was not nearly as dramatic as the split ticket on the federal level. Even though it seemed like there were obvious candidates for each faction, the presidential election actually came down to a four-way race. The two frontrunners were naturally John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, but for some reason, many national Republicans supported Henry Clay and split the Adams-Clay Republican vote. There was also William Crawford, who kinda ran on a platform of not left or right but forward, which managed to win more electoral votes than Clay, but ultimately just played as a spoiler for both major candidates. The results ended up being that no candidate won the required 131 electoral votes to become president. Jackson did manage to win the popular vote, and had 15 more electoral votes than Adams, but the rules set up in the 12th Amendment to the Constitution stipulated that the election would be decided by the House of Representatives. The vote would be done by state, with its members forming a committee and deciding which of the candidates with the 3 highest electoral vote totals their state would vote for. Crucially, this eliminated Clay from the running and allowed the National Republicans to wholly support Adams. Controversially, this meant that 3 states that Jackson had won in the general election had their delegates support Adams instead. One of these states that flipped was Louisiana, the site of Jackson's great victory at the Battle of New Orleans. It is likely that this state's treachery stung worse than any of the others. The aftermath of the 1824 presidential election was the end of the era of good feelings, the rupturing of the Democratic Republicans, and the formation of the second party system, which was built around Jackson's Democratic Party and Adams's National Republican Party. It is important to note that while the modern-day Democratic Party is a direct continuation of this party formed around Jackson in 1825, the National Republicans are not the Republican Party of today. They will dissolve and reform as various other parties through the course of American history, always in opposition to the Democratic Party. Just thought that should be made clear. In the end, it seemed the elections of 1824, both federal and Louisiana state, were settled in the interests of New Orleans, at least the politically active. Adams sought to strengthen America on the global stage by promoting internal stability and trade while negotiating advantageous agreements with foreign powers. The ways in which this broad strategy affected New Orleans was the creation of a road between Washington, D.C. and the Crescent City, linking the most important city in the South with the nation's capital. Adams also supported tariffs that would protect American industry. At first, this favored New Orleans as it relied heavily on supplying sugar to the United States and was in direct competition with Spanish Cuba and British Jamaica. Tariffs would allow the sugar plantations of southern Louisiana to outcompete its foreign adversaries. But the tariff that Adams ended up instituting was not on sugar, but on cheap manufactured goods from Great Britain, which the South relied on since they lacked the industrial capacity to make their own. This hurt the residents of New Orleans and other southern cities, and is a large reason why Adams lost support in the South. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, the election of Henry Johnson to the governorship wasn't a clean break from the ethnic divisions that had been the foremost issue of previous administrations. Johnson was an outspoken President Adams supporter, and therefore retained the support of many of the wealthier residents of Louisiana, regardless of their ethnic background. But the split between Creoles and Anglos was not so easily wiped out, as it was embedded not only in politics, but in geography and business. The Creoles reigned supreme in the south of Louisiana, in New Orleans, its satellite settlements, and surrounding plantations, which primarily produced sugar, while the Anglos were most prominent in the north of the state, in Baton Rouge, newer settlements, and cotton plantations after the style of other southern states. A chief concern among the different parties was the location of the state capital. The Creoles still held power over the state government despite not having nearly as much representation among its officials, because New Orleans was still the capital. New Orleans was still a very French town, and as long as the capital remained there, the Creoles would have to be heard by whoever resided in the governor's seat. The Anglos wanted to move the state capital further north, out of Creole home territory, and therefore wrest control of the state out of their hands. It was this issue that sparked violent riots in the streets of New Orleans, which forced Governor Johnson's predecessor to resign. Johnson managed to find a compromise position that avoided violence. He began the process to move the capital out of New Orleans, but did not go as far north as the Anglos had hoped. They settled in Donaldson, a small settlement that had recently grown up around the sugar plantations some miles west of New Orleans. The area was predominantly settled by Cajuns and Spanish settlers, so it wasn't exactly an Anglo seat of power, but it also wasn't nearly as Creole favored as New Orleans. This movement, and later issues revolving around preferential treatment of cotton farmers over sugar cultivators, lost Johnson whatever little goodwill he had with the Creoles, and all but doomed whichever Anglo candidate next ran for governor. However, as we have already hinted at, ethnic divisions were not the only sources of friction in New Orleans politics at this time. One of Governor Johnson's most notable opponents was fellow Anglo-American Edward Livingston. We have mentioned Livingston before, making note of his relation to his brother Robert Livingston, who negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, and Edward's representation of Jean Lafitte in the negotiations with Andrew Jackson regarding the terms of the privateer's help in the defense of New Orleans. But Edward Livingston's most important contribution to New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana was his brilliant legal mind in the realm of civil governance. In 1826, Livingston published his magnum opus, a code of laws and procedures with regard to criminal cases, which he submitted to the Louisiana state legislature for them to adopt. They never did adopt Livingston's code, but it was recognized across the world for its brilliance and for being of a more enlightened and understanding mood compared to the draconic criminal codes of the Middle Ages. Many legal scholars hailed it as a great step forward in the rationalization of criminal law. Yet the legislature did not appreciate it, even though Livingston should have been a part of the Anglo-American political bloc that controlled the state government. His public persona as a Jacksonian man was simply ostracized by the Adams men in the legislature. He did eventually contribute significant parts of the 1825 Civil Code that, through several revisions throughout the years, is still the basis for civil governance in Louisiana to this day. The drama of national politics cast a shadow over New Orleans during the 1824-1828 terms of John Quincy Adams and his man in Louisiana, Henry Johnson, but overall the city made its way through the waning years of the era of good feelings with substantially good feelings. The political turmoil may have seemed foreboding when observed under a microscope, but with a broader view, New Orleans was thriving during these times. As we covered in the first half of this episode, the population was booming and money was pouring in from the lucrative sugar, cotton, and slave markets. The prosperity enjoyed by many of the citizens of New Orleans under the Adams and Johnson administrations meant that the city and state would remain one of the few centers of anti-Jacksonian support in the South. Even though Jackson won the state in 1828, it was by a much slimmer margin than any other state in the South, and the state government would remain in the hands of Adams' supporters. The 1828 elections also marked the official and final split of the Democratic Republicans into the National Republicans under Adams and the Democratic Party under Jackson. In Louisiana, the gubernatorial race came down to two National Republicans, one a Creole and the other an Anglo. This time, the Creoles rallied behind their frontrunner, and Pierre d'Urbigny, a French-born New Orleanian, won the race. It is with the election of d'Urbigny that we must end this episode. Next time we will go over the chaotic late 1820s and early 1830s political scene, and tie it into some of the changes we see coming to New Orleans during those times. So please join me in the next episode for the history of New Orleans.